But in 2011, 2012, some of my first videos on this channel are talking about condemning Obama for the murder of a U.S. citizen.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I am the producer, Rory McElhone, joined by our political intriguer, Robert Morris.
How's it going today?
It's going very well because the UK has called a general election, so it's all very exciting.
Oh, that is exciting. Yeah, there was that amazing visual of Rishi Sunak trying to give a sort of announcement speech as he's being rained on. I just thought that was
Yes, it was incredible. And you didn't hear the speakers, did you?
No, I have trouble watching video clips online. I usually find them just embarrassing for everybody involved.
Okay, so no, he tried to call it. It looked like it wasn't raining originally, and then it started to rain, and then there's a very famous protester. He's very anti-Brexit, and he brought along some speakers which played a song, Things Can Only Get Better by Dee Ream. This is a song synonymous with when Labour won in 97. It was incredibly loud because his microphones are kind of like mine. They were right in front of him. So for the fact that it was able to be picked up by them showed just it was incredibly loud to the point where I think he was struggling to hear his own voice. And the man destroyed his speakers doing so, but it did make for quite the spectacle when he could have called it indoors.
It's nice to see a British Prime Minister, especially of the Conservative Party, just get kind of shouted down like that. Frankly, it's amazing that they're still in power.
Yeah, he does come across quite petulant, but yes, it won't be for long. They think he's called it now, so his children can enroll in school in California by like August.
By the deadline. Well, there you go. There you go. I don't think anybody's really expected Rishi Sunak or the Conservatives to win, but who knows? Who knows?
That just shows us how powerful America is. That ex-British Prime Ministers can't wait to go there, and sadly, that is what we'll be talking about in today's episode, which is about dirty wars and how America does whatever it wants around the world.
Specifically, what I want to talk about today is special forces and the way that sort of special operations, special forces, drone wars, assassinations, kill squads, various kinds of warfare that I guess make for interesting video games and seem pretty cool, are actually not very good at accomplishing goals. And despite this, they are attaining disturbing power over the U.S. military and even the U.S. government. In small ways, but you can see a pathway for this to continue and grow. I think we should mention that we've got sort of a source text for this episode. I read Dirty Wars by Jeremy Scahill. And Rory, did you watch the movie?
I watched the movie, so we'll both have different takes on the same thing from different angles, so it should make for good listening. What ways Jeremy Scahill portrayed in the media?
I've always enjoyed his work. He's sort of in part of a very small class of journalists that attempt to be somewhat adversarial in their reporting. Unfortunately, in most national security reporting, you have variations of Pentagon stenography. It's like they're court reporters just copying down what the Department of Defense wants to be said. There are, and Jeremy Scahill is one of them, and there are many others. They used to sort of all be centered at The Intercept, but now they're all going their separate ways. Ken Klippenstein comes to mind, Glenn Greenwald. Historically, though, he's certainly gone in some interesting directions more recently. They are folks who actually attempt to find out whether what the government is telling us is accurate. And Jeremy Scahill has done some really amazing work. This book I found absolutely invaluable. It is kind of interesting. He also seems to be interested in portraying himself. This is a 10-year-old book as sort of a, somewhat, crusading journalist. And I don't know if that came across more in the film. I usually find that sort of thing kind of
what
annoying.
I'd say to give him respect is he actually goes to these places. He both goes to Yemen and Somalia, which we will be touching on in our next episode. So he is, somewhat in danger's way. Like Somalia, he did portray it as like significantly more dangerous than Yemen, which I think it shows just how bad things are.
I mean, to be clear, I absolutely loved this book. I found it invaluable. I found it delved into some stuff I knew a little bit about and wanted to know more, and like opened new pathways for me to look into. But it's weird because like the pictures section has like some relevant stuff to the narrative, and then there's like glamour shots of like him in a war zone, and it seems a little odd.
Well, one thing I did find is we do have shots of him putting like thumbtacks into chalkboard with, you know, important people, and there's also, you know, the very famous photographs of the torture in Guantanamo Bay.
Yes.
He obviously had those printed out so then he could look through them as if he was just given them, but like no one has those photographs. You just see them on like a computer screen and stuff. So there are some bits that are a wee bit like, oh, he did this himself to, I guess, dramatize it a little bit. But apart from that, I didn't find it too bad.
Well, I'm bummed I didn't get a chance to watch the film. Highly, and I probably will at some point, highly recommend the book. However, it is a book that ends in 2013, so we're going to try and take the story a little further forward over the course of this podcast.
Would this be a man you agree with? I felt like pretty much a lot of what he was saying were things that you've been talking about this long time, and how this is something that America really shouldn't be at, because there will be a state where America is sort of at too many wars that it can sort of have a negative effect on its dominance over the world.
Yeah, I there's very little that I could find to disagree with in this book. There's some emphasis that I may have, you know, I wish he'd gone a little further down that route, or I think he's at one point, there's a passage where he's really dismissive of the training efforts that special forces engage in. And as we've seen in the Sahel, that honestly, it can be one of the worst things that the U.S. government does, training up these militaries that then turn ethnic disputes into jihadist insurgencies and then take out democratic governments. Generally speaking, Jeremy Scahill is a guy I've often agreed with fairly strongly, and really only more so having read what I guess is sort of his 500-page magnum opus.
How does the book open? Because it sort of starts, we have like an American soldier in Afghanistan, and he's like,
what's the focus of your campaign here?
In southern Nangarhar, we're dealing with the Ashkar Kyle tribe. You know, the wording I'll get right probably when we leave next year, but...
So he sort of portrays them as he's incredibly powerful, but somewhat not so keen on the detail. They're just given a vague direction of people to kill, and, well, they'll do that very well.
So the book really centers the story of the al-Awlaki family, which we'll perhaps get into in detail later. It's essentially the first U.S. citizen openly targeted by the U.S. government for death without any kind of due process. Not the first U.S. citizen killed in the U.S. terror war, or even, so not the only U.S. citizen killed by the U.S. government during the U.S. terror war, or even in Yemen, in fact. But this one was explicitly targeted, and the Obama administration seemed really invested in creating a legal authority to kill U.S. citizens, which is very terrifying.
Was it the fact that his name came out before he was killed? It was like, oh, I'll go try to talk to this man that's on a kill list that hasn't been killed by America yet, when they could theoretically try to deport him.
Well, for years, they openly, I think for the space of 18 months, I mean, his family had ongoing court cases being, in the United States saying, don't kill our guy, you can't just kill our son.
But hadn't he worked with the American government at times?
Well, it's an interesting question. So after 9/11, Anwar al-Awlaki lived in the United States at that point, and he actually became sort of a go-to guy for the moderate Muslim reaction to 9/11. He condemned 9/11, and then the Afghanistan and especially Iraq, yes, once again, Abu Ghraib, the 2004 revelations of ongoing torture that was carried out at prison in Iraq. Really disturbing part of this book is that Jeremy Scahill points out that actually Abu Ghraib was really just the tip of the iceberg, and that was just sort of some low-level enlisted army clowns beating up some prisoners, where in fact many, many, many worse things were happening in many worse prisons that we'll never actually get the details of. So anyway, the book really begins and ends and centers the plight of the Awlaki family. The really horrific thing is that in a separate strike, not claimed by the U.S. government to be targeted at him, but in a separate strike, they actually managed to kill Awlaki's 16-year-old son, who nobody has alleged had any connection to any kind of radicalism.
Well, two things.
Also a U.S. citizen.
the way the American drone wars work is quite often you'll get a +1 and +2. We've talked about this, that you can kill this guy, but if he's with his child, you're allowed 1 death, but not 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. But this wasn't like that. This was completely a different day, a different incident. I think he went to look for his father's body. Was that it?
No. Well, initially he'd run away. He was in, I believe, Sana'a, perhaps, or a more central urban area in Yemen where there was little danger of being attacked by a drone. And he just wanted to go out and talk to his father. This was before he had been killed. He learned that he had been killed, was actually intending to go back home to his parents and grandparents, but wanted to delay it a little bit because Yemen, again, in part because of U.S. drone wars and U.S. counterterrorism, was falling apart at that moment. He's like, I'll just delay a day or two, and he was sitting around a campfire with his cousins and was blown up. Really kind of a horrific detail, but that's sort of what the book uses as sort of its framing device.
Did it show photographs of the son? Because I think something the film does very well is it shows the father just talking, and his voice is very underwhelming. It doesn't sound like this big scary cleric. He has a sort of like slightly nasal voice, and there's something funny about watching him with an American accent driving around America in like a station wagon. It's like, oh, is this enemy number one? Are you sure?
After September 11th, all of the feelings of the American Muslims were similar to everybody else in America. Feelings of sympathy.
So that was interesting, but also just showed him as a child at birthdays and stuff. So it was very good at humanizing him and just showing this was just a kind of normal child trying to get along in life.
Yeah, no, I think the whole Anwar, the al-Awlaki thing is worthy of a podcast of its own at some point. It's a truly horrific precedent that has been set. I was aware at that point of, I'm not sure if I was aware of him before he was killed, but in 2011, 2012, some of my first videos on this channel are talking about condemning Obama for the murder of a U.S. citizen. Thus far, it seems like that horrific precedent hasn't been used yet, but it's always used again yet, but it's always there. And as we've seen, certainly during the War on Terror, these old precedents just, haunt us forever. But what I want to focus on today is probably special forces specifically. And that dominates this book. The actions, and I presume the movie as well, the actions of special forces, JSOC, incredible power that they amassed during the first decade of the war, the U.S. terror war. And I think you could possibly make an argument that emphasis has faded a little bit in the second decade. I looked a little bit for sort of an update from Scahill on sort of how have things gone in the years since. And I was able to cobble together a bit of that myself, but I'm sure somebody's written the book about the second decade of the terror war, or perhaps talking about both of them, but I haven't gotten my hands on it yet. The story he tells here is, I think, tremendously important. Just one more qualifier, something that, not a critique of Scahill, but something that I found myself falling into as I was preparing this episode. This is by no means the only thing that was going on in the U.S. terror war.
Oh, yeah.
The Pentagon is this massive, incredibly powerful, incredibly wealthy institution with literally millions of people doing a wide variety of things, and U.S. Special Forces are by no means the only ones that are doing failed or illegitimate things. But it is, I think, a central story that's strangely becoming more central. The one thing that I thought was really worth emphasizing, so anyway, the story that this tells is the evolution of our special forces. And strangely, this story starts kind of in is it 1979 or 1980? I can't remember which it was, where Jimmy Carter attempted to save the hostages in Iran. In 1979, I believe it was, they were taken hostage. A variety of diplomats in the embassy in Tehran were taken hostage. And as an attempt to win, I believe, the 1980 election, Jimmy Carter sent, I guess, Delta Force was sort of our premier special forces force at that point to try to take back these hostages. And it was a tremendous failure. I think there was an accident in the desert. They ended up aborting the mission. I think actually at least a handful.
Operation Eagle Claw.
Yes, Operation Eagle Claw, at least a handful or maybe half of the guys on the trip were killed in a helicopter crash. It's just a famous fiasco. And perhaps appropriately, perhaps not, the lessons learned from this was, we actually don't support our special forces well enough. We need to give them more resources, and we need to give them a sort of independent existence from the branches that house them. So you've got the Navy SEALs, Special Forces. You've got the Army Rangers. I guess Delta Force and the Green Berets are also under Army.
Well, I know Delta Force was like its own thing that only the president answers to them. So they were like super elite and sort of their own wee thing. Quite often they would have been used for like if there was hostages, say, in a aircraft. But apparently they're getting used a lot more for just bad policy.
And I mean, these are the Chuck Norris movies. I don't know if anybody remembers, but the classic Chuck Norris films of, I guess, the 1980s and perhaps early 90s were Delta Force. Actually, I guess they're not that classic. I think everybody my age watched them, but they have not stood the test of time.
Okay.
So Delta Force, yes, it was this, answers only to the president, but I think the problem that was identified with Operation Eagle Claw is that they didn't have any resources. Like, they couldn't actually control their own helicopters, they couldn't control their own way to get in, and so you got, and this will be a theme of this podcast, you got a lot of infighting between services and agencies of the U.S. government, so it was thought wise to first establish JSOC in 1980, which is sort of a joint task force or combatant command, and then in 1987, it was formalized further as SOCOM, as a separate combatant command. So we have geographical combatant commands. We've talked about this in a very early episode, that are sort of weirdly like how the U.S. runs the world. They're sort of imperial viceroys. And special forces were given their own command, their own way to organize resources and put things together that they would be able to use at a moment's notice. This was perhaps a worthwhile development. I can't really point to much during the 1980s and the 1990s that these special forces were doing. I'm sure there are examples. I'm sure they did stuff in Panama. I'm sure they did stuff in the first Gulf War. Very tantalizingly in this book, he mentions multiple times, on 2 occasions at least, U.S. Special Forces operations in Chechnya in the 90s.
Wow.
Which is something I'd like to know. I actually messaged him. I was like, could you tell me a little bit more about that? I've yet to hear back from him. Yeah, because
Hopefully he'll be on the pod at some point.
So if there were U.S. Special Forces in Chechnya in the 1990s, that sort of tends to confirm Vladimir Putin's paranoid vision of the world. So that's actually something that would be interesting to hear more about. Regardless, there just wasn't much for these special forces to do until 9/11. And after 9/11, as is incredibly capably documented in this book, in country after country, special forces became tremendously important in how the United States fought wars. And I would argue, I don't know if Scahill would say this quite as explicitly. Actually, I think he does towards the end of the book, quite damagingly. In fact, a lot of these uses of special forces functioned to make the United States weaker, frankly, created worse situations in Iraq, in Somalia, in Yemen, certainly.
Well, the idea goes that you sort of have like a tribal leader or someone that's in charge, and the special forces are very good at killing that one person, which then means all the people that are secondary quite often fight amongst each other. So we tend to have like a spike in violence once these special forces are successful.
Yeah, a spike in violence, and where we used to have one jihadi group, we have 2 jihadi groups. And any group of civilians that were killed in these attacks, and they are frequently killed in these attacks, becomes the source of more jihadi foot soldiers. So just functionally, it just doesn't work very well, but it's very satisfying.
Yes, there is something that does seem like you're just getting these incredibly talented group of individuals to just go in and get that bad guy. And if a few civilians get killed in the process, well, it's for the greater good. There is a great feedback from it.
Mm-hmm. People love it. It's. I think we're well into the second decade. I think perhaps in the first decade, I can't point to pop cultural examples from the first decade of the century that were glorifying special forces. Those special forces were tremendously important and becoming tremendously more powerful from 2001 to 2010, but certainly after the 2011 assassination of Osama bin Laden, something that I'm still all for, though we could have probably arrested him.
Well, that's what he was arguing on El Trap House podcast when he was talking about a couple of years later, which is like, was there any attempt or was there anybody pretending that we were ever going to arrest this man and put him on trial? Like, they were going to kill him regardless.
Well, I mean, as I pointed out before, this is the last guy who could tell us exactly how involved the Saudi Arabian government was in 9/11.
Well, yeah, you don't want an intelligent man in court basically saying about all the terrible things America's been up to in the past 20 years.
Or just saying, yeah, I did 9/11 and I did it with these Saudi princes helping me. So really what SEAL Team 6 mostly did was close down our last avenue to find out what really happened on 9/11. But anyway, we don't need to... The pop cultural result of that assassination was SEAL Team 6 specifically and Special Forces more broadly. I think there was already some lionization. I mean, we've got the Delta Force movies in the 1980s. But it really just, up to the max, to the point where I think there's a couple examples. I think we've got examples from like the Houthis, and what was the other one that was so great where, certain examples from the Islamic State where you realize that these guys were adopting the operator culture and signifiers of the U.S. Special Forces, where like even our enemies were like, this is what looks cool now. Yeah. So they just, the bushy beard and we've been lifting and we've got, baseball caps and like, it just this whole romantic image of these guys who are going to go out and get the bad guys. It's a testament to, I'm not saying these forces are entirely useless. I am saying that they're probably more dangerous than they are useful. But there are certainly instances where that they've done helpful things. But it's a real testament to the infantile nature of specifically the Bush administration. And I think the book is really, really good on this.
Although he does sort of defend Bush because he seems to understand a lot of these smaller squabbles are a bit pointless. But Obama, they just sort of threw the book at him and were like, oh, this could happen and they could take this plane and they could take this bus. It was like every scare story that the CIA and any other alphabets about could throw at Obama to panic him. They threw at him, while it seemed to be Bush was a bit more sensible and knew kind of what they were up to. Well, the Bush administration.
It's interesting. There's a dynamic that's really, really, really not holding true for Biden, but that you can kind of look at in the Bush administration, in the Obama administration, and finally even the Trump administration, where at the beginning, because we haven't had I guess Biden would be the first non-amateur president we've had since the first Bush in the 90s. But they get in there, they get snowed by the generals, and the initial years of the presidencies tend to be extraordinarily violent. Obama was talked into Libya and the surge in Afghanistan, which were both...
And the drone wars.
Incredibly counterproductive and useless things, and the drone wars. And then, sort of by the end, he's like, actually, maybe a little less. Bush, finally, it took him 6 years. But at the end of those 6 years and incredible calamities, he did appear to rein in Cheney and Rumsfeld. In the book, it really seems like the story of the Bush administration with special forces is Cheney and Rumsfeld, the Vice President Cheney and Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, just really running riot, just essentially trying to cut out any kind of legal oversight, trying to cut out most of the generals, trying to cut out the CIA, and essentially get a direct connection to JSOC to do whatever they wanted, and also giving special forces a pretty wide remit to do whatever they wanted.
They don't seem to mention Bush that much. It's a bit more of the mechanics of it. Like it starts with this wedding where two pregnant women and a man are killed. And it has footage of that. They have like sort of Nokia-style phones. They show that, and it was a bit like, oh, there's no evidence for this, but you can hear the Americans talking over, pointing at the bodies and saying what certain things they're going to do, what line they're going to do. So it doesn't necessarily talk about the Bush administration in that much detail.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I guess it would make sense for a film that came out in 2013 to be much more focused on Obama's drone war.
You know, it's talking about who's in the room when Osama bin Laden's killed and stuff like that.
Oh, interesting. Because that's all that's definitely in the book, but it seems like he wants to tell the whole story here. And the story that I got that was actually really instructive, because I was cognizant and an adult and following news during the Bush administration. And just the extent to which the Secretary of Defense and the Vice President, nominally in the name of George W. Bush, but just sort of consolidated extraordinary power in their offices and extraordinary power to kill and destroy. And I think Scahill, I don't know if he ever comes straight out and says this, but I think he heavily implies that one of the reasons why the insurgency in Iraq was so awful was because JSOC was just running around killing all kinds of people, just killing anybody they wanted, and actually didn't have much of a connection to the U.S. Army and U.S. Marine elements that were trying to maintain an occupation.
Well, there's emphasis on this. Do you remember the deck of cards? It was like all the top generals and all the bad people we need to kill. There seemed to be kind of like, once you had that, it was like, well, this is some guy that knows him, so we'll go after him, and then it's a guy that knows a guy that knows a guy, and it just seems to spiral, and they're just killing pretty much anyone. And
Exactly.
And also, they changed the definition. Basically, 15-year-olds up, male, they're all terrorists and bad.
Yes. I think that was a scandal that finally came to the head in the Obama administration, where we realized that from 9/11 on, the U.S. government was saying everybody we kill is terrorists. And the assumption by journalists, by a lot of people, by American taxpayers was that, well, if they say they're a there's support for these people being terrorists. And no, it was quite simply that if anybody was in a U.S. drone blast who was a male over the age of 18, they were called terrorists with no support. It was just, we killed them, they must have been terrorists.
Yeah. And there's also a part where he's talking to a high-ranking official, and he's talking about these pregnant women being shot at a wedding, and he's a bit like, well, I've been shot at by a woman, and, well, if they were involved in X, Y, Z, then, well, it's okay to shoot them. And, like, there's no remorse. It's quite shocking.
I've been shot at by women myself. So that doesn't, and I mean shot at, that doesn't excuse them. They die just like men do if they shoot at us. So
there's no remorse, and there's just this idea that, well, they could have plausibly maybe have been bad for us, so it's fine that I just murdered this entire family. And it's truly out of control during the Bush administration in Iraq and Afghanistan. In Iraq, so again, you've got these people in the regular Army and Marines who are trying to run a country, and you've got JSOC just running around accountable to nobody other than Cheney and Rumsfeld back in Washington, D.C., killing anybody they want.
So I remember hearing on the podcast, What a Wonderful Way to Die, they were part of the sort of regular army, as you talk about, and quite often they'd have to clean up some of these special operations. They'd be told, oh, these were such and such, and they're like, clearly these were just normal Joe Soaps that happened to live here.
And Scahill, I don't know how common this was. I don't think it was the only occasion, but Scahill, I assume in the film as well, documents a particularly horrific example where special forces, on the basis of pretty shoddy information, target a family in Afghanistan and murder the entire family, including, perhaps this is what you were talking about, with the 2 pregnant women. And it turned out that the family that they had murdered was actually strongly anti-Taliban and included a member of the police force that was working closely with the regular, the U.S. regular army of occupation.
That's also in the interview with this high-ranking official. He's basically said, well, just because he's police doesn't mean this, because he was trained by the Americans. He could be working for the Taliban. He could be this. He could be that. So it's just like, you know, whatever.
Yeah. Anybody we kill is worth killing. But just how infantile the Bush administration's approach to this was. We took over these countries. We were responsible for order. And we've got these effing cowboys running around just murdering people because it's satisfying and it's kind of cool looking. Another great testament to why men shouldn't be running things, I guess.
It also it scares me in the sense that, are you aware of I'll be spoiling the film and book Jarhead, but in it basically he's taught to be a sniper, he's taught to be a sniper, and he doesn't get to. His chance is missed. And there's almost this feeling of, I've been taught how to use all these toys, I've been taught all this stuff, and now we get to do it. And there's this sort of mad mission creep where we get to kill these people, we get to kill them, we get to use this toy. What about this? There's just this, we've been taught to do it, let's do it.
We figured out that we could do these things, and it is impressive that, you know, we can spend millions and millions and millions of dollars to go kill guys with AK-47s in caves. It's an impressive capability that we can kill anybody anywhere in the world or whatnot. But it becomes very clear that there's almost no thought about whether we should or whether it actually helps. So in Iraq, special forces attacks first against the playing cards, the Ba'athist regime figures that were left. You know, they ran their way all the way through everybody who might have worked for the Ba'ath Party, and then they ran their way through the sort of Al-Qaeda in Iraq under Zarqawi that had largely been created by the U.S. invasion, and they just kept killing and killing and killing and killing and killing. In the process, killing a lot of potential allies and a lot of people who could have helped to make the country more orderly. And I hadn't quite appreciated the extent to which special forces assassination teams helped to make Iraq as hellish as it actually was. Just awful years, 2003 to 2009 or so, when the United States presided over a horrific civil war. Afghanistan is another example where this approach, not necessarily special forces kill teams, but drone assassination was pretty much the main focus for 20 years, and we're not there anymore. Like, we just straight up lost. These are not useful tools.
I feel like it's just, well, you're using the wrong tool. It feels like because they have this freedom, they do kind of do a lot more, but it's great for your Bin Ladens, your hostage negotiations. This is what they're great at, but they're almost trying to do what an army does, which is, you know, tens of thousands of people with a small team. And it's like, just do the small team thing again, do it again. And it's just this horrendous mission creep of murder everywhere with, you know, because they are so secretive, there's so much they can get away with and lie about and say this happened and that happened.
Exactly. And so the Bush administration just provided an incredible example of like how important it is actually for these kill teams to be reined in, and for like, because they, in Iraq and Afghanistan and in other places over and over and over again, they weren't just making it hard for U.S. civilians, like State Department people who are trying to run these countries. They were also making it really hard for the regular military that was trying to, you know, win hearts and minds and do counterinsurgency when you've just got death squads. And I think that's the appropriate term here. Like, and I think makes it very clear that certainly during the Bush administration, these special forces became unaccountable death squads.
But it would seem that they operate in more countries than they don't, because there's 120 countries Special Operations Command are in, which is a terrifying thought.
Yeah, and it's never, we're never really, I mean, we all know, like, it's, you know, 10 to 12 Muslim countries, but what are all those other ones? I assume it's most of Africa.
It's also the term deemed a threat, like, you know, what one person thinks is a threat, another person doesn't.
So I think by the end of the Bush administration, even George W. Bush, who did finally, much later than he should have, unceremoniously kick out Rumsfeld, one of his daddy's boys, Robert Gates, in there to try and pick up the pieces. It was clear to everyone that things had gotten way out of hand. Unfortunately, I think that while the U.S. public had certainly gotten sick of losing U.S. soldiers, they had not, in fact, fallen out of love with the idea of drones and targeted assassinations and this idea that it could somehow be useful. And Obama, it's a very disturbing picture of Obama that you get from the Dirty Wars book. I don't know if it's
well, he's sort of the main enemy of this, I would say, since, you know, it rarely talks about Bush. It is because Obama's in charge at the time, so obviously that makes sense.
So you're saying JSOC is able to hit harder under President Obama than they were under President Bush?
Harder, faster, quicker, with the full support of the White House.
Because it seems that certainly for political reasons, when Obama ran, he was against the Iraq war, but he was like, oh, we're going to do Afghanistan right, was the idea. And he quickly became convinced, in part because obviously he didn't want to do what Bush had done and put all kinds of regular U.S. armed forces in harm's way. He basically took Cheney and Rumsfeld's out-of-control cowboy nightmare force, formalized it. He essentially made it legal. He essentially figured out how to use it. I was surprised to see that sort of William McRaven, who I think was the number 2 guy to Stanley McChrystal, doing a lot of the Bush era special forces murders, is again just someone who's just, and that's the thing, these people just look cool, you know. They typically, if you're going to be in charge of special forces, it means that you've already made it through incredibly grueling, whether you're a Navy SEAL or an Army Ranger, or you just made it through lots of grueling training. You're incredibly physically fit. You're incredibly dynamic, and you take decisions. And it's kind of clear that both the Bush and Obama administrations, you know, everybody's got half a boner for Stanley McChrystal and William McRaven. You know, they're all just, they've got crushes on these guys because they look like such American heroes. Yeah. So basically, what Obama says is we're not going to have the volume of just completely accountable mass murder that Special Forces is doing anymore, but we're definitely going to keep murdering people. It's really important that we keep murdering people. We're going to make it legal. We're going to start a process. We're going to and essentially, he provided a tool to Trump and every other successor, which is a legal framework, a legal architecture. The Bush people weren't very good lawyers. You know, their torture memos have sort of been remembered now as war crimes. Their attempts to, unfortunately, were stuck with a lot of their legacies, Guantanamo and whatnot, just because they, you know, it's nobody's figured out how to solve those issues. But I mean, there were a bunch of idiots. Obama is a constitutional lawyer who had a lot of really dedicated, really smart people working for him who have created a nominally legal, a manifestly unjust and evil system by which the United States can assassinate anybody it wants. Famously, with Anwar al-Awlaki, Obama even insisted that the U.S. citizens can be assassinated, which essentially shreds the U.S. Constitution.
If anyone's deemed a threat worldwide, they're a target.
I'm frankly surprised and pleased that we've seen so few further implementations of this in the ensuing, 13 years. But it'll get picked up again. And to be clear here, like the U.S. government, I have no doubt, throughout the Cold War, killed many U.S. citizens. I'm sure. But what's different here, and what is really messed up about what Obama did, is that it's legal. It at least has a superficial veneer of legality. If the CIA or some other skullduggerous agency during the Cold War killed a bunch of U.S. citizens, they didn't then put out a press release and, you know, use the Department of Justice to fight against that person's family in court. They just sort of, you know, pushed it under the table or threatened the families or individuals involved or wiped out anybody who would know, which is, of course, all terribly bad, but it's actually worse in some way. No, it's worse in most ways, I would say, for the U.S. government to assume the right to kill U.S. citizens on the basis of a somewhat legalistic determination by the president. It's really, really dark. And also, Obama oversaw some pretty spectacular failures. So the book is all about the most value that I got out of the book, and the reason why our next podcast will be on this country, is the coverage of Somalia. And the truly, I'd been vaguely aware of this and I've read briefer accounts and I've talked about it before, but just going year by year how it worked. The United States really wanted to assassinate people in Somalia, and I think with a decent justification, I suppose, if you think assassination is the kind of thing the U.S. government should be doing. There was definitely Al-Qaeda presence there. It's a Muslim country, and with very little government, which we'll talk about next episode. And there were certainly Al-Qaeda folks there, but what the United States did was, you've seen the film Black Hawk Down and all these terrible warlords. So what the CIA decided to do between 2001 and 2006 was start funding the warlords and start giving them weapons and giving them perks to help us assassinate
Because he
people.
does talk to one of them. He goes to Somalia and he talks to him, and he's basically saying, like, America's just great at this. We knew very little compared to when the Americans started to train us. Like, they rule the world, and they'll show you some incredible stuff when it comes to fighting. Like, I thought he might have been more like, oh, well, we know how things are here, and they don't really know much. But no, he was like just in awe of America, but just was very happy to take their money.
Masters of War or something, yeah.
America knows war. They are war masters. They know better than me. So when they funded a war, they know how to fund it.
However, we picked a really bad horse because these people are just awful. And they also were really bad at running the country. And the obvious stepped up bombing by the United States, facilitated by these guys, actually brought about something really, really, really positive. But it was not positive. It was not intentionally brought about by the United States. And because the United States didn't like it, we destroyed it. We had the rise of the Islamic Courts Union, which essentially in a few miraculous months in 2005 and 2006 was able to finally bring peace to Mogadishu. And it was also really well suited to Somalia, which is a country that has to deal with sort of federalization issues, arguments between different groups, because it was from the ground up. It was these Islamic courts that sort of founded in disparate areas to bring about peace, and then they sort of unified under one guy. There were absolutely, in very small part, some connections to Al-Qaeda and what would eventually become Al-Shabaab. But everybody agrees that this was a tiny part of the Islamic Court Union's movement, was not at all its main focus, but it was too Muslim for the Bush administration. So we destroyed it and went in, sent our special forces guys in to hunt and kill Al-Qaeda and people in the Islamic Courts Union, and we convinced Ethiopia to invade on top of that. And it was a complete disaster, a country that had already been destroyed.
One of the poorest countries in the world.
Yeah. Had finally managed to put itself back together, and we came in and destroyed it again. In the process, we crushed the Islamic Courts Union, which meant that this tiny faction within it, the most fanatical and anti-U.S. one, got tremendous legitimacy. And that is the birth of Al-Shabaab, the horrific terrorist organization that's now famous for blowing up Kenyan malls, among many other things. And another 17 years later, and this is the Somalia conflict had solved itself by year 15. Now we're 17 years after that. And there's still U.S. forces in Somalia. There's still African troops from other countries occupying Somalia. And there's still a significant Al-Shabaab presence. So this sort of special forces approach first brought about the rise of exactly the sort of government we didn't want, and then we destroyed that government. And now Somalia is in ruins, and is retained in ruins, and it's quite.
But also they then join into Yemen as well. It just seems to be a greatest hits of impoverished Muslim countries.
And greatest hits of just incredible poor results. In Iraq, special forces essentially added fire to the insurgency that killed thousands and thousands of U.S. troops. In Afghanistan, this approach, we lost the war. In Somalia, we restarted the war in chaos. That actually, it was crushing the Islamic Courts Union is one of in 2006, 2007 is sort of like the biggest impetus for Somali piracy. So, and in Yemen, I guess the only reason that Al-Qaeda hasn't taken over all of Yemen, it did, and I think in 2011 and also in 2015, Al-Qaeda took serious territory in Yemen. The reason it hasn't taken over the whole country, and also in Iraq, we finally brought about peace in Iraq. 2009, we finally killed enough people. And then in 2014, you had the rise of the Islamic State. And so I suppose in Yemen, the only reason Al-Qaeda hasn't taken over is because the Houthis hate them. And the Houthis are a different anti-U.S. force that now controls the country and is blockading the Suez Canal. it's an extraordinarily failed approach. This sort of, and I know I'm conflating things. Part of the cursedness of this topic is, A, it's secret, B, it's complicated, and C, it's constantly changing. It depends from president to president. With Bush, it was cowboy murder fest. Under Cheney and Rumsfeld. With Obama, it was like carefully controlled murder fest. Under Obama, carefully controlled legal murder fest. Trump, it was back to bonanza. There was, game on. Apparently, in his first 5 days in power, he launched 74 drone strikes, which was basically 5 times Obama's rate. In 2017 and 2018, he did 238 separate drone strikes across a variety of theaters. Again, those are the ones we know about.
Yeah.
Those are the ones we know about, much more than Obama's. I think in the second 2 years of Trump's presidency, the drone war did slow down a little bit. I don't think it ever slowed down to the pace of Obama's, but it just, it's funny because a lot of people were like, why are you creating this streamlined authority to kill people? Like, it'll be abused by presidents to come. And to just go from Obama to Trump, it's just like instant vindication for everybody who made that criticism. So it just like nonstop. I mean, you remember, like, he thought it was fun. There was that one thing in Afghanistan where he's like, we've got a thing called the Moab, the mother of all bombs. I'm just excited to drop it. I mean, like, this thing's basically like big enough to destabilize geologies, and he just thought it was fun to drop it.
I think it's the biggest non-nuclear bomb you can drop.
Yeah. And just like, because, I mean, the Bush administration and the Obama administration seem to, have these crushes on these special forces figures, and Donald Trump took that to the nth level. It does seem that by the second 2 years of the Trump administration, and initially, of course, Trump, I guess Jim Mattis is a Marine, not a special forces guy, but he just clearly loved his generals. Mike Flynn is kind of fascinating aspect of this book, Dirty Wars, is because it is a decade old. There's people in here who have subsequently shown themselves to be complete clowns, but are treated as very serious. One of the most serious special operations generals, the guy who really sort of put together, he was the intelligence guy for the Joint Special Forces stuff throughout the first decade of the century, was Mike Flynn, who has proven himself, one of the guy who was so incompetent and so insane that he couldn't last in the Trump administration more than a couple days, and has subsequently distinguished himself by being a big QAnon guy. This is the QAnon guy is the intelligence genius at the heart of the first decade of special forces in this century. That should tell you a lot about just how bad and how dangerous this stuff is. So anyway, Trump loved Mike Flynn, Trump loved Jim Mattis. By the halfway point of his career, all of the military people associated with him had reached the realization that he was a absolute idiot, and most of them had resigned. And I think there was a slowdown in the amount of drone stuff that was being carried out because, frankly, Trump had lost the respect and the administrative capability to. Basically, Trump wasn't competent enough to long-term manage the murder process that Obama had put in place. So I guess, yay.
It's just a terrible thought.
So we've got this special forces approach, drones, assassinations, what have you, that has proven to bring about terrible results, not for people, not for humanity, not for human rights, but terrible results counter to U.S.'s strategic goals in Iraq, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, and Somalia. Like, it is a loser strategy that has brought us loss after loss after loss. And its influence is just growing. One of the most disturbing things that I did to research for this was look into, so SOCOM has its own combatant command. It has all kinds of resources that have been growing massively throughout the U.S. terror war era. And CENTCOM, so this is Central Command that is in charge of the Afghanistan theater and all of the Middle East, and now also Israel-Gaza. So you've got Michael Kurilla, the head of CENTCOM, is becoming more and more important. So these combatant commands we have a podcast talking about them from a number of years back. They are essentially how the United States governs the world militarily. And the most important of those combatant commands is CENTCOM because it has the most to do. It overlooks Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Israel, Gaza. It's just super busy. And I think the way this goes is that the power over CENTCOM oscillates between the Army and the Marines. So the Marines alternate with the Army, but the last two guys who have, this is Votel between 2016 and 2019, and Michael Kurilla from 2022 to the present. These are, in the top 5 most important people in the U.S. military for sure, in charge of what we do in the Middle East and Central Asia. And both of the Army guys came up through Special Forces.
Oh, great.
So basically, despite this experience in Iraq where the Special Forces are creating an insurgency and getting in the way of the real military, now the folks in charge of the real military are Special Forces.
So is there any pushback to reduce the amount of power they have, or is it always just give them more power, give them more to do?
I think there's constant pushback. I think that Obama's attempt to legalize and bring things in, I do think that comparing the amount of death dealing, the lack of control, the insanity of Rumsfeld and Cheney's running of Special Forces, as bad as what Obama did was, I think what's bad about what Obama did is that it set these horrific precedents. The level of death wasn't as high under Obama. It's just the idea that he systemized it. I think a lot of people expected, and I think he had the potential to simply stop it, Obama, and he chose not to. Instead, he chose to formalize it. But that was absolutely and even in the late Bush administration, I think by firing Rumsfeld, and I think it depends on what you read, but I think there's some indication that he might have kind of reined Cheney in a little bit in his last couple of years in power. It does seem like there were efforts to get away from that. I mean, just if you're talking about counterinsurgency, as certainly the Bush administration was with Petraeus and the surge in Iraq, you've got to rein in your assassination squads a little bit, and I think that probably happened. So there's constant pushback, but never enough pushback to actually take away these powers and resources that they've built up. The whole Sahel thing, and we've talked about the mystery of what went on in the Sahel. There's just no reporting on it. And we did finally get kicked out by Niger and a number of other countries. But, we're still trying to work our way back into Chad or whatnot. That was almost entirely a Special Forces show, and with that $250,000 drone base. So far away from what we're discussing more broadly, like these institutions are metastasizing. Joe Biden got, I think, to some degree, very caveated, legitimate praise for ending the drone war. In fact, he really, really did dial back on the number of people that were being slaughtered. However, he did not take away an iota of authority or budget or power from any of these institutions. And now we've carried out, over the past 6 or 7 months, we've carried out 150 strikes in Yemen. Some of that is drone stuff. Some of them, I'm 100% sure that JSOC is a big part of that.
But it's also the fact that America was doing strikes on Yemen before Saudi Arabia, and now it's like, now Saudi Arabia stopped, it's like, oh, well, we'll get back to our old faithful of bombing them again.
That's a key thing, and I'll be emphasizing, I've got a Yemen video coming out hopefully in the next couple of weeks, which is sort of how Yemen beat the U.S. terror war. And 100%, like there would not be Houthis in power. There would not have been as dramatic a collapse of the Yemeni government if it weren't for a solid decade of, I think our first drone strike outside of the Iraqi, outside of the Afghani theater of war.
I think it was
before Iraq.
Technically not a country America is at war with.
Yeah. And so it was basically before Iraq, and it was our first strike was in Yemen in 2002. And we've been hitting it, we hit it for the decade after that. Obama really accelerated the drone war in Yemen. And that acceleration of the drone war really don't get me wrong, Ali Abdullah Saleh, the dictator at the time, was a really bad dude. And there were many, many reasons he was illegitimate. But U.S. counterterror war had a lot to do with the disintegration of that country.
But Jeremy Sahel agrees with you in the sense that he thinks Saudi Arabia may just collapse one day.
Oh, did he say that?
He did on that El Trapo Trap House podcast.
Oh, that's good. I mean, 8 years ago.
He says you could just wake up one day and it's like, it's just gone. Because he says there's very little political movement in there. He says if you're, say, homosexual or atheist, if your parents are high enough connected, you might be allowed to live or not go to jail. But he says if there's anything with you trying to set up democracy, it's probably death for you. So he says there's very little on internal politics, we get to find out. So it could just go like Ceausescu.
Yeah, we just don't know. Biden was being celebrated for ending the drone war or what have you, which now looks absolutely ridiculous. I wanted to mention Trump in his last days attempted to pull all of our troops out of Somalia. I think actually did sort of pull all of our troops out of Somalia, which was essentially useless, which basically just means they moved from Somalia to Djibouti, which is one country over, and continued to do all the bombing and killing. And by 2022, Biden put our troops back into Somalia. So that sort of didn't happen. But just sort of special forces generally, this is going to sound a little paranoid, but it's thinking not in terms of years, but in terms of decades. Like what we've created here is really, really, really bad. U.S. military, the idea of a standing army, that's something that I'm kind of reconciled to. I guess if Abraham Lincoln and FDR put it together, it can't be that bad. Certainly the founders of this country were against the idea of a standing army, and it's the slippery slope that they were worried about is something that we are bombing down in the first decades of this century. We've created in these special forces this unaccountable, secret, heavily armed, heavily resourced, can go anywhere and kill anybody for any reason that they feel is okay. And yes, presidents, the Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, the regular military are all at a point where they're able to want to fight against that. We didn't talk at all about just the running battles between the CIA and special forces that we've seen across the past 20 years. But, but it's mostly agency infighting at this point that's keeping special forces from doing whatever it wants.
Wow.
Law isn't a barrier. Obama set up laws saying they could kill U.S. citizens. It's not, there's no, and I believe William McRaven or, Michael Kurilla or, I believe that these are patriotic Americans who believe that they're doing what's best. But as you described from this documentary, that those patriotic Americans convinced them, not Bill McRaven or Kurilla, but whoever that was being interviewed, convinced them, it's, you know what, we're in these people's countries and we're murdering whole families. They probably deserve it. Being patriotic, loving your country, thinking you're being of service, being legitimately of service, making sacrifices I would never make, doesn't mean that you're actually serving freedom or the U.S. Constitution. And I think most of the U.S. public is still on board with the idea that we should be able to go assassinate people who want to blow up our jetliners. But what is it going to mean 20 years from now? What is it going to mean 30 years from now? What I think, to be clear, I think the idea that there's going to be violence over the 2024 election or whatnot, or serious violence or system-challenging violence is nonsense. But what about the 2044 election or the 2054? I'm not sure if that's where the fours are. But what
Who knows what happens? There might be a surprise election.
It seems unlikely.
But
who knows what's going to happen? And the model that comes to mind more than anything else is that of the Praetorian Guard, which is a Roman idea. These were these special military forces that were set up to protect the emperor when the Republic went from a republic to an empire and sort of lost what little representative elements that it had.
So are you worried that these special forces will be used against American citizens inside America?
Of course.
Oh,
I mean, of course. Not yet.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody born in the 20th century would think to do that. I don't think anybody, but like, who knows what the world looks like 10 years from now, 20 years, 50 years from now. But so this Praetorian Guard that was set up to protect the emperor within a century, if not within a couple decades, was picking the emperor. And there was very little in U.S. political life before 9/11 or before 1980 where you could point to something and be like, that looks like a Praetorian Guard. And now we've got one. Now we've got this incredibly powerful, unaccountable military force that can do whatever it wants. I think that's a really, really bad thing to have, frankly. And also, as I think we've documented to some extent, it fails. Like, it does not serve U.S. interests. It looks really cool. It makes cool video games. It gives like nerdy people who work in presidential administrations hard-ons. It is not actually something that is worthwhile. And it's potentially like, this is how, not this year, not this decade, maybe not even this century, but stuff like SOCOM, JSOC, unaccountable special military forces, that's how the American Republic dies.
Okay. Well, I, for one, welcome our new Special Forces overlords.
Okay.
And we shall catch you next time. The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.